Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to the sanctuary. Looks like we got another boat. That means we got another topic. I'm still Professor C, though, and we're still going to be talking about A and P. But we're going to switch topics and move on to the bones. Specifically, I'm going to look at the structure of long bones, some flat bones, and what's called the Haversian system. Sometimes I refer to this as the introductory to the bones. So, without further ado, alright, it's good as usual if you're going to start a new section just to talk about the general functions of bones and kind of lay down the groundwork, some of the basic terminologies that we'll be using for several lectures. So let's do that first. So most of these are common sense, but it's good to see them here just listed out so you can know it's more than just support and protection. I mean, everybody can come up with, your bones are for support and protection. It's some of the other things that get lost. Yeah, movement is interesting, and of course your bones don't move themselves. There are enlarged skeletal muscles, hence their name, to pull the bones into positions that you want your bones to go. So it is strange to see them there sometimes, but movement is a function of the bone, although not by themselves. So this next word is hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite. It's like appetite like you're hungry, but it's not like you're hungry for hydroxy. It's a different kind of appetite. It has to do with minerals. So hydroxyapatite is a type of mineral storage. Some examples would be like calcium salts, magnesium salts, like phosphates that are stored in the bones. So a little tricky one there to remember. You store like calcium in the bones. You've heard that since you're a little kid. But it's a little bit more complicated than that, but we're not going to get too far in the weeds. Triglycerides, we've had talks about this, seems like forever ago, on lipids. Fats, right? Triglycerides are fats primarily used to store energy in the body. And a place you could do that in the body is inside what's called the marrow cavities. I'll underline it here. Inside of your bones. You're going to draw a picture of some bones in a minute so we can see a little bit more of the anatomy inside. But there's a type of marrow called yellow marrow that is fatty. So think about, butter is fatty, so yellow is butter. And if you see kind of the butter inside of the bones, that would be yellow marrow. And it is fat storage, energy storage. Hematopoiesis, a word we've seen before, but it means, again, hemato, referring to blood. And poiesis is some sort of event where we make something. So a blood-making process, hematopoiesis. The rule is all blood cells are born in the bone marrow. So not only does bone marrow store yellow marrow, it could store red marrow. And red marrow, just remember blood is red, so the red marrow has something to do with making blood cells, or hematopoiesis. So yellow marrow for fat storage, red marrow for making blood cells. Okay, you could call this bone texture. Now, I know if you've come along this entire ride with me through my lectures, you've seen this top one before. This looks like tree ring structure here, right? Where we have kind of a hole in the center and then these concentric circles heading out from the center, almost like ripples if you threw a pebble into a pond. You also see these little black discs that are around those concentric circles. And you say, I've seen that before. We call that bone when we're looking at our histology chapter. And we're right, but that's not the only type of bone texturally, structurally, that we find in the human body. The one underneath it looks quite different, right? I don't see those circular patterns, right? I see it looks more like a honeycomb to me. Whatever it looks like to you is fine, but a spider web or a honeycomb, much, much different. It looks like there's little beams of bone and quite large holes in between the beams, much like a honeycomb network. So let's take a peek here. The top is our compact bone, or sometimes we call it Haversian bone because it uses the system known as the Haversian system, which we're going to get into a little bit more in a minute. It's the classic tree rings, right? The big circle, I'll circle another one, is an osteon. So there's an osteon, here's an osteon, although not perfectly in screen. Up here at the top's an osteon. So when you see osteons, you know we're looking at haversian or compact bone. The concentric rings, if we can recall, are called lamellae, singular lamella, and they're specifically there to bear weight. They allow bones, well, compact bone in this matter, to bear weight. The bottom one is spongy bone, because, well, it looks like a sponge, right? Another word for that is cancellous bone, spongy bone or cancellous bone. It does not have the haversian system. It does have, you know, canaliculi and lamellae and all these structures. It just does not have the osteons. And you usually only see spongy bone in this way. And most bone chapters in textbooks focus solely on compact bone, and there's not much said about spongy bone. So we'll make some points, but really we're just going to be aware there is this kind of beam-like, honeycomb-like spongy bone or cancellous bone made of trabeculae. Trabeculae is the fancy word for beams. So if we're going to bear weight with trabeculae and cancellous bone, that's kind of like saying we can bear weight with lamellae and the compact bone. Okay, here's another kind of a close-up and an artist's view on top of it of the osteon system. Again, right, I can circle an osteon here. What you're seeing in the top image is the border of an osteon. And in the center here, this black hole that's in the middle of the tree rings is called the central canal. And I can see that listed right up here, the central canal. So what you're looking at is a close-up of an osteon up top and a few osteons down here on bottom. Here's one I'll outline. I can outline one here kind of, and I can outline one here, a big giant one with a large central canal there. The lamellae, of course, again, are the concentric rings that come out from there. Their main point, again, is weight-bearing, and those look like the tree rings. They're made of collagen, if we haven't mentioned that so far. Collagenous, weight-bearing, bony matrix. Of course, the central canal does look like a black hole when you see real histological images of it, but in the artist picture up top, you can see there's, you know, a blood vessel here, a nerve over here, so you can have blood vessels, artery, veins, nerves running through those central canals. Another picture of it, an artist rendition of their idea of what this haversian system would look like. Let's start with things that we know. We can see an osteon here, right? A big, large, circular, bony unit. What's the thing in the center called? Well, it's called the central canal. What should we find there? Blood vessels and nerves. You know, there's another osteon here and another osteon here. Got a central canal here, central canal here. So it's just showing us multiple osteons again, but showing us kind of a side view of what's happening. So a new structure we haven't seen is this thing right here. I'll put a halo around it, and I'll kind of run a line all the way over here like that. That's called a perforating canal, or old school, a Volkmann's canal. And notice it does not go up through a central canal. It kind of connects two central canals to each other, and that's what it says it does here. It lies at right angles to central canals, and it connects the blood vessels and connects the nerves of the central canals to each other. And ultimately, to the area over here we're going to draw a picture of momentarily of the medullary cavity, this space in the center of a bone, especially a long bone, we have larger blood vessels and nerves running through. If we want to see another picture of a Volkmann's canal or a perforating canal, I can actually go back in the talk and look right here where my red arrow is being drawn, this black thing that goes from this central canal over to somewhere off screen here, perhaps this central canal. That's a Volkmann's canal cut perfectly down the line there. So you can see them in histological images as well, but there's some really nice images on this artist drawing of what a Volkmann's canal is. Okay, so some other terms we'll talk about as we get into bone formation. Osteogenic, right? Stem cells, baby cells that are told to do a specific thing from other tissue. So osteogenic referring to osteogenesis or the formation of bones. So we have these osteogenic stem cells that will give rise to other cells like blasts and clasts and osteocytes. Now, if we remember from previous talks, blasts refers to a cell that is building something, right? And if you're building bone, the word for that is here in red, deposition. Just like you're depositing money in the bank, you would deposit material to make the bone stronger or thicker, right? So when we're depositing the bone through deposition, osteoblasts are doing that. And they're doing it by laying down that hard matrix called osteoid. Now, what's going to happen to these poor osteoblasts as they lay down osteoid is they're going to get kind of stuck in a corner. So if I could draw, let me say here's a central canal right here, and here's a lamellar ring, and here's a lamellar ring, and here are some osteoblasts, we'll call them now, and they're secreting osteoid. And they're laying down that matrix that forms those lamellar rings for weight bearing. Now these guys up here, they've already kind of painted themselves surrounded by osteoid, and these guys are going to paint themselves around an osteoid. Eventually they're going to get trapped in there. So that's what these osteoblasts do. They lay down this calcified matrix called osteoid. And before they get stuck inside of these spaces forever and die, they're going to send out little channels to each other, kind of like where I put those arrows, these little spidery looking legs that come out, and those are called canaliculi, or little canals. One would be a canaliculus. And that's what you can see if you look at the images over here. You can see them very well. It looks like the cracks all throughout the bone matrix are the little canaliculi, those channels that were extended before the blasts actually died. And it says here, if I can get my ink out of the way, when those mature cells, when they're all surrounded by osteoid and they've made their canaliculi, they finally do die. And we call those osteocytes, and we can see them as little black spots, right, reaching out their spidery arms to each other in the form of canaliculi. Okay, clasts, and this will become important when we talk about some of the hormonal influences on bone growth. Clasts break things, right? If blasts are makers or builders, clasts are destroyers. They are responsible for what's called bone resorption, that is tearing apart bone and resorbing it into the blood. So the verb is to resorb, but we say they're responsible for an act called resorption with a P. It's a little strange on the spelling, but just think about resorbing, pulling the bone matrix away, destroying it, and sticking it back into the bloodstream so the body can use those calciums or those phosphates that have been stored there. Okay, I think the thing to do here is to see a few factoids and at the same time, sketch out at the bottom of this slide here these structures for you to see. So let's take a look at some long bones. Let's draw kind of a cartoon bone, and we can kind of make it look like this if you want, just for fun. And then let's draw the rest of it here like that. Now, the main thing is, I want you to see the shaft part of it, and we're going to ignore the tip ends. And it is called a diaphysis. Diaphysis. So this long shaft here, I'll just kind of put a halo here, is called D for diaphysis. The things on the end, the expanded ends, we'll see in a minute. Let's just deal with the shaft for now. Here's where we'll find a medullary cavity. That is a cavity in the center of the diaphysis. All right, I'm going to get my D out of the way so it doesn't make it too cloudy. All right, so the next thing I'll do is I'll say that lining the medulla, lining the medullary cavity, is going to be a little bit of spongy bone or cancellous bone. So let's make the spongy bone look kind of curly like this. And let's draw it in here. So you'd have a little spongy bone, right, that would surround the medullary cavity. So I won't draw it very thickly. I'll just show that it is here, kind of like it's a spring or a very, very, very long pigtail. But there is the spongy bone that would be surrounding the medullary cavity. It's very thin. Beyond that, the rest of the thickness of that diaphysis is going to be compact bone. And we'll draw compact bone just like some hash marks. And so all this out here is compact bone. Most of the thickness of the shaft is compact bone. Only a thin layer of spongy is lining the medulla. So I can draw on the other side as well a bunch of thick, compact bone out here like that. And that is the basic structure of the diaphysis. Now, what's going to happen here, we're going to see, is the bone becomes wider at the diaphysis. It doesn't grow longer here, it grows wider. So this is called appositional growth as the bone increases its width. Inside the cavity, you will find marrow. Now, but there's two types, right? If you're an adult, you will have time to have eaten enough fat in your life to have stored it here. So most of the time in the pictures, you see yellow marrow inside of this cavity, this marrow cavity or medullary cavity. But remember, infants, newborns, have not had enough time to accumulate fat. So if you see the inside of an infant's long bone inside their marrow cavity, you will find red marrow there. And in fact, infants only always have red marrow, and that's kind of the trick to remember. Babies always have red marrow, and you acquire the yellow as you become an adult. All right, so it's a pretty good image of the diaphysis portion of a long bone. If you wanted to continue our picture, I could switch back here and just show you the expanded edges. Again, I'll kind of draw like a cartoon bone. So we just see one of the ends. So let's put the medullary cavity here in the diaphysis. Remember, we had a little bit of spongy bone here that lined the medulla, but most of this out here was compact bone. Just to remind you what we just drew on the previous slide. But now that we're here in the end of it, we're going to call this an epiphysis, or plural would be epiphyses, and there would be one on either end of a long bone. And we're going to get into proximal or distal epiphyses when we do our review at the very end here. But the epiphyses are the expanded ends. And this is where long bones will increase their length. Remember, in the diaphysis, they got wider. But here in the epiphyseal end, you may hear it called, where the epiphyses are, this is where we're going to see bones get longer. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to draw a little rainbow up here, not quite at the border between the compact bone of this diaphysis, but at some point here, you'll see that medullary cavity end, and you'll see it replaced by primarily spongy bone. So I'm just going to take the time here to scribble in some spongy bone. Now there still is some compact bone out here on the edge, and I'm going to draw it here like this, but it's not a very thick layer like it was in the diaphysis. And that idea will continue all the way around these epiphyses. We'll see a small or thin layer of compact bone, but most of this is spongy, spongy, spongy. I won't make the curl so small so I can fill up the space fairly quickly here. But there is the pattern of the epiphyseal end of the bone, the expanded ends. Mostly spongy with a thin layer of compact around it. So the first thing, no medulla. The medulla ends when the diaphysis ends. And yes, I know some places might call this a metaphysis, M-E-T-A, metaphysis. It's somewhere in between the diaphysis and the actual epiphysis at the end. I don't really get that picky in my talk, but you may hear that term metaphysis in some textbooks. Okay, now another difference here, you won't find yellow marrow here, even if you're an adult. You only find red marrow. So I'm going to sketch in some red marrow here, just like that. So no yellow marrow here. If you are an adult, you will have yellow marrow here, but if you're an infant, you will also have red marrow there because you haven't had time to acquire the yellow marrow. All right, as I said a moment ago, thin, compact on the outside. This time they've switcherooed from the diaphysis. And you may see, and it's usually blue, I'll do it kind of like this, you may see some blue on the surfaces of the bone that are going to touch other bones, right? So wherever we have a touching going on, this is called an articulation. So we can look at articular cartilage, the type of cartilage that will help us articulate with another bone. If you see it drawn in blue there, that is going to be articular cartilage. All right, now we got the rainbow here still. Usually it is just shown as a white bar, so I'll try to draw it in here where you can see it. But this rainbow here that kind of cuts through the metaphysis or through the middle of the epiphysis, if you want to call it that, that's called an epiphyseal line, which makes sense. It looks like a line running through the epiphysis. Now what that is the leftovers of a cartilaginous structure known as an epiphyseal plate, also known as a growth plate. Now remember, the idea is this is exactly the spot where long bones become longer. They grow here, and it's called a growth plate here. As you're growing, as you're getting taller, that epiphyseal structure, here called an epiphyseal plate, will push this epiphysis further away from the diaphysis. And then when you're done growing, when you become an adult, that growth plate will seal up and it will become an epiphyseal line. So that structure, that rainbow structure there in the epiphysis or metaphysis, is either called an epiphyseal plate or an epiphyseal line, depending on whether you're talking about a child or an adult. Okay, so a thing I could have drawn on a long bone on top of the diaphysis, and you can see over here in this image, it's very well done, this kind of blue layer on top. You say, well, we drew some blue on the epiphyses, but no, that was articular cartilage. Here on the diaphysis, you would not see another bone articulating on the diaphysis, so there shouldn't be any articular cartilage. But there is some, looks like a banana peel or something on the outside of this bone, and it's called peri meaning around, osteum, so something that's going around the bone. Now what you're seeing here is a protective structure for the bone, but also underneath that protective structure there's a place where the bone grows. Remember, this is where, in the diaphysis, this is where the bone gets wider through appositional growth. So the periosteum is the structure that's going to have those baby cells, called stem cells here, I'm underlining, where we get that growth. You can see the structure is glued down here where I'm making a big oval. These little fibers are kind of burrowing their way into the bone and they're holding the periosteum down. These are called perforating fibers, or sometimes old school style, they're called Sharpie's fibers. Equally true, if you could see it, and there are very few images where you see this well. So I'm just going to show you a child's bone. Now, how do I know this is a child's bone? Well, I see that it's got red marrow inside of the long bone. It's telling me this is not an adult yet, or it would have yellow marrow there. So lining the medullary cavity is another structure where we have bone growth. So it's not just on the outside. Remember, the periosteum's out here, helping the bone get wider like that. But we needed something inside this medulla that's going to help the medulla get wider as the most superficial part of the bone gets wider. So this is the endosteum. So it is the membrane that does osteogenesis that lines the medulla. It's often left out of pictures. It also has blasts and clasts, makers and breakers of bone, for osteogenesis. Same way as the periosteum did. But as we said, as the periosteum lets the outside of the bone get wider, this lets the medullary cavity expand as the bone gets bigger. All right, to talk about a flat bone is something that can be done fairly simply. So let's look at it. Think about the skull bones, right? The skull bones don't have a shaft or an expanded end and epiphysis. They don't have any of that business. They look like very flat bones. So what I often say is, look at this kind of like a taco with the meat inside of the shell. And that'll kind of help us get to the meat of what a flat bone is here. So let's check it out. Compact bone, and I'll put a C here and a C here. There's the compact bone. And that would be what I would call the taco shell, right? And then the meat in the middle, this is spongy bone right there. Now, the only thing that's different is the spongy bone is now referred to as diplo bone with the funny little umlaut on top of the E. So really, the spongy bone and flat bones is now referred to as diplo bone, even though it is spongy bone. Now, what is the rest of this stuff? Well, there's some periosteum here. There's some periosteum up there. And these little fibers that are holding the periosteum down to the bone, remember, are called either sharpies, I can write like this, or perforating fibers. The trabeculae, those beams that make up that meaty looking spongy bone called diplo, has red marrow only, always. And it nicely shows that in this picture. All right, let's end this session with a practice. Let's label some parts of a long bone. First thing that I would do is come over to the left-hand side and say, well, this is the big D, the diaphysis. Diaphysis, the shaft. And then on top are epiphyses. So I'll put epi for there's one epiphysis. There's another epiphysis, but we could get a little fancy and say this is the proximal epiphysis because it's nearer to the head. And this would be the distal epiphysis because it's further away from the head of the body. That's all well and good. We have the shaft and the proximal and distal epiphyses. Let's get a little bit more here. Well, I see a medulla. That's easy to label as well. The middle of the bone there. And this must be some compact bone, because I know that's what most of the bone is in the diaphysis, especially on the outside part. If it did have something on the outside labeled, which it does look like it has right here, I could probably call that the periosteum. Periosteum, I missed my E there. Fine, where the layer where the bone grows underneath that. And notice the endosteum's not labeled here. You could put it here, you could say with endosteum. Yeah, with an endosteum, it's not shown. So here on top I have, well, this is the spongy bone up here, right? That primarily makes up the expanded end of the bone, or the epiphyses. So there's some spongy bone. And notice the blue out here, the blue outline on the epiphysis. That's cartilage that will help us touch another bone. So I'm going to call that articular cartilage. And then that just leaves this little rainbow that's not spongy here. That would be where the bone is getting longer, or did in the past. And because this is an adult bone, I'm going to say it is because I see some yellow marrow here. And remember, infants, children don't have a lot of yellow marrow yet, or any at all sometimes. So there is a structure that helps the bone get longer, or has in the past. So that would be the line instead of the plate. Remember, if it is actively growing, we'd call that a plate. And then it's an epiphyseal plate. Or sorry, that's the epiphyseal line. Okay, there's our review. Hope you enjoyed our talk on long bones. Check out some more that I've got on bones coming up. And thanks for watching that one. See you next time. Bye-bye.